Hey everyone, this is a short lecture just thinking about some of the dominant approaches that exist within sociology. Now, this is not a comprehensive approach, meaning that we can't capture everything because sociologists take a lot of different perspectives to looking at things, but these are some of the most dominant ones. In a sense, the questions that you ask, the ideas that you're trying to explore in the world are based on what tradition you come from. The other thing that's really important before I get into these individual approaches is that people combine these, right? Just because you are approach one, functionalism, doesn't mean that you also don't pay attention to symbolic interactionism. Those go together very often. Same as conflict theory and symbolic interaction. People are always combining these, but these approaches push you to ask different questions and come from different intellectual traditions. Now, the dominant approaches in sociology are generally thought of as functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. I will briefly describe each of those and will return to those ideas over and over throughout the semester. Now, it's important that there are other dominant approaches which are more modern, generally more modern, and they sometimes fall from within those previously discussed traditions. So, for instance, feminist theory, dominant perspective within sociology that asks key questions about gender roles, how we define gender, what opportunities are available or not available based on the gender that you are assigned or identify with, right? That is an important perspective within sociology. Also, depending on how you're employing feminist theory, it could look a lot like functionalism, conflict theory, or symbolic interaction. Same with critical race theory. The questions that you're asking about race, either in the United States or globally, depends on the tradition that you come from, right? If you're focused very much on that micro level, as we'll talk about, it will look more like symbolic interactionism. If you're focused more on inequality within society or the history of inequality, then it looks a lot like conflict theory, right? So there's all these different approaches. And again, the other thing I'll point out is for each of these approaches, there's lots of different scholars. They might not even have the exact same idea, but categories are always like that. You push people together and you say, well, this fits this category. It's not perfect, but it's a way of mapping out the world. Same thing as if you're trying to categorize animals, right? Why do you call certain things a certain species, and other things a different species? It's just trying to map out the world. Postmodern theory, you would include someone like Foucault. You would include someone like Deleuze. You would include someone like Derrida. They would all have very different ideas about what they're doing and have lots of disagreements with each other. We call it all postmodern theory. All right, let's get into the actual three dominant ones in sociology. First one, functionalism. The founder of this approach is Emile Durkheim. That's who we generally trace this idea to. The general argument or perspective that Emile Durkheim has is that each social institution, which we've talked about in class, has a particular function. That's why it exists. If it didn't have a function, it wouldn't exist. And together, all the institutions reach an equilibrium help society reach and hold an equilibrium. However, because of that, if you disturb one institution, then other institutions have to change to restore that balance. Durkheim is inspired by biology. He's thinking of society as an organism. So, for example, let me try drawing on this slide. Let's see how well this works. All right, so this is a bad drawing of a human. It's really hard to draw with a mouse. You could look at the human and say, well, each organ has a different function. What do the eyes do? Well, the eyes matter because they see. If you lose your sight, then you have to rely on other senses, right? You have to rely on your hearing more than before to figure out your where you exist within a space. You have to rely on your smell. You have to rely on your touch, right? You have to develop a different type of kinesthetic awareness. Your lungs provide oxygen. Your heart provides pumps blood, right? And all those things have to be in equilibrium. You can't have your blood going up and then going down how fast the heart's beating to a degree, right? It has to maintain a balance. So he's looking at society in the same way. And he says dramatic change happens when an institution is disturbed and other institutions have to fill in those responsibilities. Or if they fail, we see something more chaotic. Think about when change happens. More and more people, especially more and more women, are going off to work. What does that mean? Well, daycares become important, right? Societies shift in how things work. When there's an external shock to the system, whether it's something like a terrorist attack, then Society responds to it. Systems are always adjusting to past changes. What Durkheim is trying to understand is, how does each thing within society fill a certain role, and what does it do? How does it help maintain balance? If we're thinking about what the functionalist is essentially asking is, how does this thing we're looking at help create stability and security, or maintain stability for people in the society? Hopefully that makes sense. Let's go on to the next one. Conflict theory. A lot of people associate with conflict theory. I'd say the person that we most often trace conflict theory back to is Karl Marx. His argument is that the driving force of all social change is conflict over scarce resources and the conflict created by competing interests. Meaning, there are limited resources and people are fighting for who gets to have them. And that the people in power create a system that benefits them, that allows them to maintain those resources, to maintain their advantages, right? So you could think of whether he's pointing out the wealthy people in a capitalist society or the wealthy investor in a capitalist society. If we're looking at history through thinking about race, we could say groups in power, specifically white people who are trying to maintain power through explicit slavery or through laws that benefit white people at the disadvantage of other people. Specifically we could look at the slave trade coming from Northern Europe and Western Europe. So what people do from within the perspective of conflict theory is simply say, who's in power, who's not in power? How is that maintained? How are people on the bottom kept on the bottom? What type of mobility is there? And then when they look at institutions, instead of asking the question that a functionalist would ask, like Emile Durkheim, he would say, well, let's look at religion and say, how does that help people in society? How does that maintain an equilibrium? What function does it serve? Same with education. How does education play this key role that allows society to continue to move forward and maintain stability? Marx, or a conflict theorist, would look at the same institutions and say, well, how do they either help people accept their place in society or keep them within their place in society? Or how does it allow people to push against that and lead to change or even potentially revolution? Right? Is it a church that teaches some sort of liberation theology? Or does it help people accept their social place and maintain order? Is it a school that teaches us radical thoughts and the ability to try to enact social change and help those without power? Or does it simply teach the history of the conquerors and kind of placate you and teach you not to try to lead to change? And he says that conflict is always inevitable. A lot of theorists from this perspective say conflict is always inevitable. Powerful people like the current system. They're going to present it as natural. They'll defend that system because they benefit from it. People suffering, unpowerful people, they won't like it. And when they don't like it, they'll try to change it. Where functionalism sees inequality as a necessity for society, conflict theory says inequality is unfair. The less powerful people in society suffer. And they say we always have to be saying who benefits from this. Symbolic interaction. Depending on who's teaching this to you, you'll get lots of different answers for who symbolic interaction is traced back to. I would argue you could say Mead or Du Bois. Those would be the best answers. Now, the pictures you have on the right are actually Du Bois on the top right and Goffman on the bottom right. So people usually say Mead, Du Bois, or Goffman. Goffman follows Mead and Du Bois. You don't need to memorize this, but it's the point I'm making. He follows Mead and Du Bois, and I would actually argue that he combines symbolic interaction with functionalism. We don't need to worry about that now. What symbolic interaction is doing is we're looking at a more micro scale, right? So we're meaning the smallest scale, and we're interested in interactions and interpretations of them. And we're saying those interactions between people, within groups, even between small groups, how people interpret the actions reveals societal constraints and meaning. So the question is, how do we generate an understanding of the world? How do we communicate with each other? How do symbols come to take on specific values and communicate specific ideas? Because when we're interacting, all we're doing is exchanging and interpreting symbols. It could be the language that we speak, whether it's English or Spanish or Mandarin or Cantonese or American Sign Language. It's a collection of vocalizations that have meaning attached to them. But it's also how we stand, whether we make eye contact or not, what we choose to wear, how we sit, where we sit, our vocal intonations. our haircut, all these things, what we say, how we say it, how we carry ourselves, it's always we're engaging in this act of interpreting others and having people interpret what we're doing. When societies change, symbols and meanings change, right? And a key point here is that our identity is always relational. The way we understand ourselves is based on the group that we're part of. And the way we understand other people is based on the group that we're part of, right? We're socialized into this. And again, we're constantly communicating with each other. And when we're communicating, what a symbolic interactionist would say is we're engaging in the activity of creating and recreating reality every single time. I'm only a teacher because you think I am. The room is only a classroom because we behave as though it is. We act towards other people, physical objects, ideas, concepts, and values based on the meanings that we've attached and connected to those things. Those meanings are a product of social interaction in human society. And you could attach lots of different things to it. Du Bois, for instance, is famous for the idea of double consciousness, right? A consciousness developed by Black people in the United States as a result of being seen both as a human, a member of the United States, but also a Black American, right? And what that actually does to the way people understand themselves and understand others. So you can combine key concepts with this. If you're studying something like gender roles, you could take more of the conflict theory approach and look at these more large-scale inequalities that exist. You could take the functionalist approach and think about how the relationships and how we define gender roles allows a certain stability in society, maybe thinking about the institution of family, for instance. Or with a symbolic interaction approach, you could say, what are all the ways you're socialized into acting a particular way based on the gender you've been assigned? How do we determine what's coded as more masculine or feminine? How is it sometimes the same action, when done by a boy versus a girl, is read in different ways or coded in different ways, right? All of this is symbolic interaction. All right, so hopefully those three big approaches within sociology make sense. Over the course of the semester, we'll be returning to this, and we'll make sure we get it by the end. And we'll also think about how it ties into some of the smaller approaches, especially if you go on and take social theory, you'll read examples of all this stuff. But again, hopefully that makes sense. I will see you in class.